Philip Bancroft strode into the boardroom as if he owned not just the company, but the very atmosphere. His suit was flawlessly tailored, his pace controlled and purposeful, his smile rehearsed for precisely this kind of debut. He moved down the table, offering firm handshakes infused with practiced charm and exchanging brief pleasantries that implied a closeness he hadn't actually earned. When he reached me, I extended my hand automatically, the reflex of a seasoned professional. He looked at it, then at my face, and kept walking without missing a step. "We don't shake hands with people who are already gone," he tossed over his shoulder. The remark hung in the room like the silent aftermath of a gunshot. A few uneasy chuckles broke the stillness. Someone rustled papers. Another person suddenly became absorbed in their phone. No one spoke my name. No one spoke up at all. I am Victor Langston. For 13 years, I built the unseen infrastructure that kept this organization afloat when doubt threatened to sink it. I engineered the financial frameworks behind every major growth initiative, negotiated protective terms during market crashes, and put in place protocols that averted crises no one ever knew were looming. My work never made headlines, but it ensured survival. Philip Bancroft, by contrast, was the headline. He took his place at the head of the table, standing to keep the height advantage. "Let's cut through the noise," he declared. "Starting today, we're building a performance-driven culture." His gaze swept past me as though I weren't there. That means eliminating roles rooted in the old guard mentality. Then, as casually as if ordering a latte, he added, "Victor Langston, effective immediately." No explanation, no transition, no recognition of over a decade of stewardship, just erasure, delivered with the certainty of someone who assumed power needed no justification. A few people glanced my way, then quickly looked away. The room settled into what could only be called complicit silence. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. And let me know your thoughts on today's one in the comments. I read every message. He went on about transformation, speed, and shedding emotional ties to outdated systems, framing cruelty as vision. The nods he received weren't applause. They were submission. Beside him, HR already held a pre-filled termination folder, signed and dated. I stayed composed. I didn't interrupt or defend myself. Experience had taught me that men like Philip feed on visible resistance. It fuels their performance of control. He wanted the room to see me flinch. He wanted proof of his decisiveness. So I let him finish. Then I addressed HR, not him. "For documentation purposes," I said calmly, "I need the exact legal wording of the termination and the precise time it takes effect." The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. Pens stilled. A coffee cup froze mid-air. Philip's smile tensed, sharpening with irritation. "Right now," he snapped. "It's effective right now." "I'll require that in writing," I replied evenly, with the date and time clearly recorded. That was the first crack in his confidence, thin, nearly invisible to others, but unmistakable to me. My initial shock had already crystallized into something denser, not anger, but pressure, the kind that doesn't explode, it compresses, sharpening into something precise and surgical. Before we go further, take a breath, notice your posture, plant your feet, align your spine. Where are you feeling this story today? If this kind of narrative moves you, stay with me. Consider subscribing. Your support keeps these conversations going, because what happened next didn't begin in that boardroom. It began the moment everyone thought the story was over. When the meeting ended and the chatter faded, what remained wasn't Philip's voice. It was the weight of all the years he dismissed with a single sentence, as if my contributions ceased to exist the moment he decided they no longer mattered. Sitting alone, memories surfaced, late nights spent fixing critical errors in executive decks that would have derailed deals by morning, rewriting covenant language at 3 a.m. because someone chose haste over rigor, installing safeguards that quietly deflected regulatory disasters the world never heard about. That work never brought praise, only silence, and I accepted it, because the work itself was its own reward. Philip arrived long after that foundation was set. He mistook structural integrity for momentum. He walked into rooms where hard-fought clarity already reigned and acted as if it had always been there. The deals I'd built from the ground up became his strategic wins. After a few well-placed handshakes and dinner party charm, he claimed credit with such conviction it seemed he truly believed that showing up equaled doing. On paper, his resume glittered. Elite schools, lofty titles, sound bites crafted for press coverage. He spoke in polished phrases full of confidence but devoid of substance. He prized credentials over capability, optics over execution. To him, contracts were paperwork for underlings. Authority, in his mind, came from the title on the door, not from understanding how things actually worked. Replaying the dismissal, I realized something sharp and sobering. Philip had no idea who I really was. He didn't know which systems I controlled, which approvals required my signature, or which protocols I'd designed long before his name ever appeared in company records. He saw a name on an org chart, not the load-bearing architecture beneath. That wasn't just arrogance, it was operational blindness masquerading as leadership. I opened my laptop, not out of panic, but habit. My inbox was quiet, except for one archived thread I hadn't opened in years. It surfaced now, a message from 18 months before Philip's arrival, flagged but never deleted, its subject line blandly bureaucratic. The subject line was bureaucratically bland. Inside was confirmation of delegated authorities related to capital deployment, written with legal precision, approved by the previous board, and never rescinded. Philip's name appeared nowhere in the document. Mine appeared in 3 separate clauses. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the pressure shift its center of gravity. The anger didn't intensify, it focused. Years of being rendered invisible, compressed into a single verifiable fact. He hadn't merely underestimated my role. He had removed the one person who understood where the actual leverage resided. That realization didn't restore my sense of professional dignity. It sharpened it into something I could use. If you've ever been treated as disposable, this story is for you. I didn't rush to action after leaving that room. Calm arrived. First, not as emotional relief, but as structural clarity. I sat with the facts and allowed them to organize themselves the way they always had when I approached complex problems. I wasn't merely a terminated employee. I was the final checkpoint in a system Philip didn't know existed. Years earlier, during a refinancing round most people had forgotten, our legal team insisted on establishing a single point of authorization for capital release. The board wanted speed, and speed required clarity. Clarity demanded one signature with ultimate authority. Mine. I had reviewed every covenant, every release condition, every reputational safeguard built into that agreement. I argued for language that could halt capital deployment mid-process if documented conduct during negotiations created material harm to institutional standing. It wasn't dramatic language, it was protective. The clause was clean and specific. Capital could be withdrawn immediately if recorded behavior demonstrably undermined. Fiduciary trust or organizational reputation. No warning period, no cure window, no committee deliberation. The authority resided with the managing signatory. Me. I verified it again, reading slowly, absorbing every word. Philip Bancroft had never reviewed it. He treated appendices as clerical background noise. He relied on executive summaries and delegated granular details to people he considered support staff. To him, contracts were infrastructure already built, not systems requiring ongoing inspection. He believed procedure existed to enable power, not constrain it. That assumption had made him comfortable. It had also made him vulnerable. I checked the record next. The meeting, the entrance, the ignored handshake, the termination. Every second had been captured. The company recorded all executive sessions as standard governance practice, archived automatically, retained for compliance review. Philip knew this policy existed. He simply didn't respect its implications. Control doesn't arrive with fanfare. It feels like silence narrowing into absolute certainty. I understood with precision how few steps remained between documentation and consequences. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger disrupts sequencing. This required order. I documented the facts methodically, time, language, witnesses. I saved the file with clear labeling and closed my laptop. Nothing impulsive had occurred. Nothing emotional was necessary. Philip thought authority was something you projected loudly. I knew it was something you exercised quietly. He had removed me because he believed I represented outdated thinking. In doing so, he activated the only mechanism that didn't require his approval to function. The clause didn't evaluate intent, it measured impact. The impact had been recorded, preserved, and authenticated. When I stood up from my desk, my hands were completely steady. The system was already in motion. I simply hadn't signaled it to proceed yet. I knew exactly where control lived. Not in conference rooms or organizational charts, but in agreements written long before Philip's arrival. The moment would arrive soon, triggered not by emotion, but by process. I would act quietly, decisively, and within parameters he had ignored. The consequences would unfold without theatrics because systems don't argue. They execute. Once set in motion, they don't pause for regret, explanation, or second chances. Control meant selecting the precise moment to act, knowing the outcome was already determined, waiting only for initiation. I waited until the building was quiet. Not empty, just sufficiently still that nobody anticipated change. There was no anger left in me. No satisfaction either. Emotion would have slowed the sequence, and I had no tolerance for unnecessary friction. I sat at the desk in my home office, phone face down, documents already open on my screen. I reviewed them once more, not from doubt, but because precision matters when consequences are irreversible. Everything aligned. Authority, scope, trigger conditions. Nothing subjective, nothing personal. I turned the phone over and dialed a single number. It rang once. "Yes," the voice answered, professional, alert, unsurprised by the hour. "Execute the withdrawal," I said, "full amount, effective immediately." A pause, brief, professional, no surprise, no protest. "Confirmed," he replied. "Reason code, documented conduct during negotiations." "Understood." That was the entire conversation. No warnings issued, no leverage displayed. I didn't explain what had transpired or why. Explanations invite debate. Debate was no longer relevant. The framework had already decided. I ended the call and closed the file. The system didn't require supervision. It required initiation. Somewhere far from my home office, processes were already moving. Notifications generating, balances recalculating, dependencies becoming visible. Nobody was being punished. A condition had simply been met. I stood and walked to the kitchen, noting how ordinary the moment felt. No trembling, no adrenaline surge. Just completion, the kind that follows finishing a project you designed years earlier. Minutes later, my phone vibrated. Then again, I didn't look. Confirmation wasn't necessary. I understood how quickly capital reacts when certainty disappears. Liquidity doesn't debate, it withdraws. What Philip Bancroft believed was stable had been contingent all along. He simply never bothered to ask on whose terms. He thought removal was an ending. It was a release mechanism. By the time midnight passed, the withdrawal was final. No appeal window, no courtesy delay. The door everyone assumed was permanently locked had been designed to open outward from the inside. I slept without setting an alarm. The outcome was already traveling through systems that don't pause for ego or intention. By morning, it would arrive everywhere simultaneously, and nothing I felt or didn't feel would alter what had already been executed. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't relief. It was alignment restored, risk corrected, and boundaries enforced without ceremony. I understood then that restraint is its own form of power. You don't raise your voice when the system is listening. You speak once, clearly, and let structure complete the work. That night, nothing dramatic happened in my home. Everything dramatic happened elsewhere, exactly as designed. Control settled fully, and I waited, knowing the consequences were already moving faster than anyone could interrupt them. Philip Bancroft walked into the office that morning with the posture of someone who believed yesterday's discomfort had already been forgotten. His jacket was pressed, his expression relaxed, his stride unhurried. He greeted administrative staff by name, nodded at department heads, and moved directly toward his corner office as if the building itself existed to serve his vision. Whatever awkwardness the previous day had created, he clearly believed. Time had already diluted it. Time hadn't. The first call came before he set his briefcase down. He waved it away, smiling, allowing it to ring through to voicemail. The second call followed within seconds, then a third. This time he answered, still casual, until his expression changed. I wasn't there to witness it, but I could visualize the transformation. I had seen that look before, the moment confidence encounters information it can't process quickly enough. By mid-morning, doors were closing. Legal convened an emergency session, pulling senior partners from unrelated matters, sealing themselves into conference rooms that hadn't been scheduled. Finance stopped distributing routine updates and began requesting confirmations that should have been automatic. Philip's calendar quietly emptied itself as meetings were canceled without explanation, rescheduled indefinitely, or converted to internal discussions that didn't include him. Then the number surfaced. $4.2 billion. Dollars no longer existed where projections said it would. Not delayed, not reallocated, absent. Entire financial models collapsed in seconds, assumptions unraveling because they had been constructed on certainty that no longer existed. This wasn't an accounting discrepancy. It wasn't a technical malfunction. It was absence where presence had been guaranteed. Philip attempted to frame it as a temporary disruption. He used words like procedural and correctable, but every subsequent call pushed him further from that narrative. Banks didn't ask questions, they demanded statements. Legal didn't offer options, they outlined exposure. Each conversation narrowed his range of motion. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth briefing, understanding arrived. Not complete, but sharp enough to cause pain. This wasn't an error, it was deliberate. It had been waiting. Before Philip could formulate a public response, the market moved. Pre-opening indicators dropped, then slid further as analysts connected information faster than executives could respond. Confidence reacts more quickly than leadership can manage. By the time the first alert crossed internal channels, the narrative had already escaped containment. People began observing him differently, not with hostility, but with calculation. He had entered the morning as a decision-maker. By noon, he had become a variable. I didn't need updates to understand how it felt inside that building. Chain reactions are predictable when you understand leverage. One withdrawal exposes another, then another, until momentum reverses direction entirely. Philip had assumed authority insulated him from consequence. That morning taught him otherwise. By the time he prepared a public statement, the story had already been written elsewhere, without his input. I didn't expect Philip Bancroft to call me directly. When his name appeared on my phone, I understood the performance was finished. The negotiation had begun. His voice was smooth, measured, almost collegial. "Let's have a conversation," he said, as if we hadn't already done exactly that. He started with incentives, a consulting arrangement, a substantial transition package, public acknowledgement of my contributions. "We moved too aggressively," he said, deploying rehearsed humility over genuine urgency. I let him finish. When he paused, I asked him to document the offer in writing. He didn't appreciate that. The tone shifted. His words acquired edges. "You can't just extract capital like that," he said. "There are serious consequences." I responded with dates, clause numbers, and the exact language he had ignored. Silence followed, longer this time. He tried again, volume increasing. "You've embarrassed the entire organization," I corrected him calmly. "The recorded meeting did that. Your behavior during that meeting triggered the clause. Nothing else." He went quiet, not reflectively, but strategically. He asked what it would take to reverse the situation. I told him there was nothing to reverse. The process had executed according to its design. He exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through. "You planned this," I answered truthfully. "I prepared for it. There's a difference." The call ended without resolution. Minutes later, messages began arriving, board members requesting context, legal counsel asking for documentation. The questions weren't about the withdrawal anymore. They were about Philip's judgment, about the meeting, about why nobody had intervened. By afternoon, the board convened without him present. I knew because the agenda language was familiar: governance review, risk assessment, conduct evaluation. Philip tried calling again. I declined. The conversation had evolved beyond persuasion. He had wanted authority without accountability. Now, accountability was examining him. When I finally received confirmation that the board was reviewing his conduct during the termination meeting, I felt nothing. Not vindication, not satisfaction. Just tension releasing into inevitability. Philip Bancroft had arrived looking for leverage. He found accountability instead. The room he had commanded was now measuring him. This time, he wasn't controlling the narrative. The system was. It didn't matter how many times he mentally replayed the moment. The facts were established. The recording existed. The board wouldn't debate tone or style. They would assess institutional exposure. That was the shift Philip never anticipated. Power was no longer performative. It had become procedural. Each step reduced his options until only outcomes remained. I observed from a distance, answering questions with precision, withholding commentary, allowing silence to perform the work. By evening, his former allies were cautious, neutral, preparing for separation. Confrontation had transformed into review. Review would transform into consequences. The board didn't need my perspective. They needed documentation. I had already provided everything. I wasn't invited when the board reconvened, and that absence told me everything. The tone had shifted before anyone spoke. Someone reopened the recording, and the room fell silent. My presence no longer mattered. The footage did. The video played without initial commentary. Philip Bancroft's entrance, his calculated smile, the way he shook every hand except mine. The pause. Then his voice, crisp and dismissive. "We don't shake hands with people who are already gone." A few uncomfortable chuckles followed on the recording. Someone coughed. Another voice murmured something about decisiveness. The screen continued. They watched him terminate me publicly. They watched him perform. They watched him enjoy it. What had felt humiliating in the moment now appeared reckless. One director leaned forward. "Why was this conducted on record?" Another asked. "Did anyone object?" Nobody answered. The conversation moved away from me without ceremony. My name surfaced only as context, then disappeared. What replaced it was language I recognized immediately. Exposure, optics, governance, failure. "This isn't about Langston," someone said. Another voice replied. "It's about leadership risk." Silence followed, heavier than agreement. I learned about the discussion afterward, not through drama, but through procedural channels. Legal outlined potential implications. Finance explained market reactions. Communications asked whether any response could contain the damage. The answer returned evenly. The market has already responded. Then, the suggestion emerged, delivered almost gently. We should consider a confidential vote. No outrage, no defense of Philip, just procedure. "Secret ballot?" someone asked. "Yes," came the immediate reply. That was the inflection point. When institutions stop debating intentions and begin measuring liability, outcomes become mechanical. I felt quiet satisfaction settle, not pleasure, but alignment. This wasn't vindication, it was correction. By the time the session concluded, nobody discussed reconciliation. They discussed succession planning, interim authority structures, communication timelines. Philip Bancroft had constructed his authority on decisive action and rapid execution. In that room, decisiveness had turned against him, and speed now operated elsewhere. I didn't need to be present to know how it concluded. When a board changes its language, the decision has already begun. All that remains is the vote, counted in silence. It happened without applause, without speeches, without mercy. That was the part I respected. Institutions correct quietly when they're serious. I closed my notes, acknowledged no one, and waited. What they called governance, I recognized as gravity. Once it engages, nothing argues back. Philip would learn that next in private, with no audience to validate him. The lesson would circulate faster than rumors, carried by minutes and signatures. I learned about the freeze before Philip Bancroft did. That detail mattered because it revealed where the center of gravity had shifted. Power doesn't announce its departure, it simply stops responding. Philip was still conducting meetings, still issuing directions, still signing documents that would never be implemented. The board's decision arrived quietly. framed as precautionary measure. His operational authority was suspended pending review completion. No announcements, no explanations, just recalibration that removed his hands from the controls. The effect was immediate. Executives who had deferred to him yesterday now sought approval elsewhere. Decisions slowed, then stalled entirely. Legal approved nothing without written verification from alternative sources. Finance redirected questions upward and received no responses. Philip's office lights remained on, but the building no longer moved according to his rhythm. Then, media inquiries began arriving. Not aggressively yet, but persistently. Requests for comment about liquidity. Concerns about leadership continuity. Philip attempted reassurance, but his words had lost traction. Statements drafted under his name waited for approvals that never materialized. I watched the coverage without emotional reaction. Satisfaction didn't feel warm. It felt exact. This was what happens when authority is borrowed and suddenly recalled. The image remains, but the function disappears. By afternoon, communications issued a revised statement outlining the company's forward strategy. I read it carefully, then again. Something was missing. Philip Bancroft's name had been removed, no explanation provided, just absence. Interim leadership was referenced instead, neutral and temporary. That omission carried more weight than any announcement could. It communicated to investors what the board wouldn't state explicitly. Philip was no longer the future they were willing to attach themselves to. He attempted to re-enter the process, scheduling briefings, requesting alignment meetings. Calendars declined him automatically. Executive assistants redirected him politely. The system had updated its permissions. I felt quiet completion settle in. Not triumph, not revenge, alignment. Systems were functioning as designed once interference was stripped away. Philip Bancroft had believed control could be seized rapidly and stabilized later. He never reached later. By the time he understood what had changed, the position beneath him was already moving, inch by inch, without ceremony. There were no celebrations, no confrontations, just subtraction. Subtraction, when applied at the executive level, changes everything below it. I recognized the pattern from previous organizational crises. Silence, distancing, then quiet replacement. It always appears orderly from outside. Inside, careers disintegrate. Philip still occupied the office physically, but the office no longer recognized him functionally. Authority had detached. Once that happens, recovery becomes theoretical. Momentum doesn't reverse. It selects a new direction and accelerates, indifferent to ego, titles, or history. This transition marked the genuine end of his tenure. Even before paperwork followed, everyone involved understood it, though nobody articulated it aloud. The decision came without fanfare, delivered in such clinical procedural language it felt sterile. Philip Bancroft was officially removed after a formal board vote, documented, reviewed, and authorized according to policy. No public accusations were made, no apologies issued, just a clean, policy-driven conclusion, the very kind of governance he'd always claimed to champion. He left that same day with nothing but a thin folder, guided out not by security, but by process itself. The hallway remained still. No one stood, no one offered a handshake. Conversations dipped to hushed tones, deliberately avoiding acknowledgement of the moment. The same room that once echoed with uneasy laughter now met his absence with averted eyes. Not out of malice, but recognition. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. When authority implodes from within, the ending follows a familiar script. Philip had demanded efficiency. He got it, cold, swift, and stripped of ceremony, just as he'd insisted things should run. Later they called me, polite, urgent, and deferential in a way they never had been before. They offered everything. My role reinstated, greater authority, public recognition, compensation far beyond fair. They framed it as restoring stability, ensuring continuity, correcting course. I listened quietly. When they finished, I asked precise questions about timelines, scope, governance. They answered with newfound care, eager to please. Then came the pause. They expected relief, gratitude even. I declined, not out of bitterness or wounded ego, but clarity. Returning would muddy the lesson. It would turn consequence into compromise, undermining the very point the system had just made. They tried again, softer. Now, we need you, I replied evenly. You needed me before. Silence stretched, long enough to feel final. Justice doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It simply completes what was set in motion and steps back. Philip learned that too late. I'd known it for years. I ended the call and set my phone down. The system had self-corrected. My part was done. Saying no wasn't loss, it was alignment. I moved on quietly, without announcements or fanfare, without glancing back. The role Philip vacated would be filled. Such gaps always are. In the end, the handshake he refused meant nothing. What mattered was the structure that had noticed, recorded, and responded with absolute fidelity. I finally understood why restraint outlasts triumph. When outcomes emerge from process, not emotion, they cannot be undone. There were no speeches, no press statements. The result stood on its own. People adapted, systems reset, careers shifted without drama. That was true justice, impartial, consistent, and unassailable. Philip's departure became a matter of record, not scandal. My refusal sealed the circuit. Nothing remained to argue, reclaim, or reframe. The work ahead lay elsewhere, built on clearer terms, grounded in genuine respect, and fortified by institutional memory sharp enough to prevent history from repeating. I walked away, knowing the outcome would endure, because systems remember what people choose to forget. Enforcement always outlasts ego, quietly, inevitably, without warning or mercy. I didn't announce my next step. I simply took it. Once the noise faded and the calls stopped, a new path opened, not handed to me, but earned through consistency. I chose work that honors boundaries, where words mean exactly what they say, and where dignity is baked into agreements, not treated as an afterthought. No spectacle, just new partners, explicit terms, and no illusions masked as confidence. I sought environments where preparation outweighs performance, and decisions account for consequences that outlive applause. The shift wasn't theatrical. It was intentional, and it held. In retrospect, the real lesson wasn't about Philip or a single boardroom slight. It was about cost. True power doesn't perform. It doesn't rely on titles or gestures. It resides in structure, in signatures, in the discipline to read what others skim over. And when it acts, it does so without asking permission. Respect works the same way. It's not a favor granted after the fact. It's the entry fee. Pay it early or pay far more later with compounded interest. Systems remember what culture excuses. They enforce what individuals ignore. I never sought vindication, only alignment. Once the conditions were met, the sequence resolved itself. No celebration was needed. The outcome spoke plainly. In financial figures, in board minutes, in changes that persisted long after the spotlight moved on. Now, I build where rules are clear and consequences are real. I partner with those who understand that silence can be strength and restraint, a form of decisiveness. I don't rush. I design decisions to endure. The work continues, steadier, cleaner, and more grounded than before. And if there's one truth worth holding on to, it's this. Authority that has to demand respect has already lost it. Respect isn't symbolic, it's enforceable. I've learned to trust process over promises, documentation over memory, and calm over reaction. Every deliberate choice reduces risk and deepens purpose. The future I've chosen rewards preparation, not bravado. It keeps score without commentary, ensuring outcomes remain intact long after the noise fades. That's the price. Paid every time. The real takeaway wasn't about losing a job or winning a showdown. It was realizing where true value lives and protecting it quietly, long before it's ever tested. Dignity isn't something you demand in the heat of the moment. It's something you embed in your work from the start. Emotion has its place, but discipline lasts. Choose clarity over chaos, preparation over pride, and the system will often correct itself. I'm curious. What stayed with you? Was it the refused handshake, the unread clause, or the moment the machinery quietly responded? If this story echoed something in your own experience, I'd welcome your thoughts. Where are you listening from today? If it resonated, please like, comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like more stories like this, raw, real, and rooted in truth, consider subscribing. Your support keeps these conversations alive.